The silence in Little Italy's most exclusive restaurant was deafening. Every fork had stopped mid-air. Every conversation had died. Because Bumpy Johnson, the man they called the King of Harlem, had just walked through the front door of Enzo Torino's family establishment. And he wasn't there for the veal. The maitre d's face went white as fresh snow. 3 generations of Torino tradition had never seen a black man cross that threshold. Not as a customer, not as an equal, and certainly not as someone who commanded respect from every street corner from 125th to 145th Street. Bumpy moved through the restaurant like he owned it. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor with the rhythm of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to gain. The expensive suit hung perfectly on his frame. Not flashy, just power dressed in wool and confidence. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was making a statement. Enzo Torino sat in his usual corner booth, surrounded by his lieutenants. The old Don had built his empire on fear and tradition. For 40 years, he'd controlled the numbers game south of 110th Street. For 40 years, he'd looked at Harlem like it was his personal piggy bank. For 40 years, he'd never been challenged. Tonight, that was about to change. Bumpy approached the table with the slow, deliberate pace of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. The restaurant held its collective breath. You could hear the kitchen staff whispering prayers in Italian. The waiters pressed themselves against the walls like they were trying to disappear into the wallpaper. "Mr. Torino," Bumpy said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that couldn't be bought or inherited, "I believe we have some business to discuss." The Don didn't look up from his osso buco. His hands remained steady, cutting the meat with surgical precision, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. "I don't believe I know you, friend." "Oh, but you do." Bumpy pulled out a chair and sat down without invitation. "You see, I'm the man whose territory you've been bleeding dry. I'm the man whose people you've been disrespecting. I'm the man who's about to change the rules of this game forever." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Torino's men reached instinctively for their weapons, but Bumpy raised a single finger. "Gentlemen, please, we're in a place of business. Let's keep this civilized." That's when Bumpy did something that shocked everyone in that room. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an apron, a simple, white kitchen apron. He stood up, tied it around his waist, and smiled that dangerous smile that had made him a legend from Sugar Hill to the Apollo Theater. "You see, Mr. Torino, tonight I'm going to cook for you. I'm going to prepare a meal that will change everything between our families. And when I'm done..." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the restaurant. "You're going to understand exactly who runs this city. To understand what happened that night, you need to go back 3 weeks earlier. Back to when Torino made the biggest mistake of his criminal career. Back to when he decided that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was just another street thug who could be pushed around. Back to when he learned that some men aren't just dangerous because of what they'll do to you. They're dangerous because of what they know. 3 weeks earlier, the disrespect had started with something as simple as a phone call. Enzo Torino sat in his leather chair, twirling his gold signet ring while his nephew Marco paced the room like a caged animal. The numbers from Harlem were coming in light. Too light. "Uncle, these people think they can hold back on us," Marco said, his voice dripping with the kind of arrogance that comes from never having your jaw broken. "We need to remind them who runs this city." Torino nodded slowly. In his mind, everything below 110th Street belonged to him. The black population up in Harlem, they were just tenants, paying rent on his territory. When the weekly envelope from Bumpy's operation came up short by $3,000, the old Don saw it as a test of his authority. That was his first mistake. "Get Johnson on the phone," Torino commanded. "It's time this uppity street dealer learned some respect." When Bumpy picked up, Torino didn't bother with pleasantries. "You're short, boy. 3,000 short. Now I don't know how they do business up there in your little neighborhood, but down here, we honor our agreements." The word "boy" hung in the air like poison gas. Bumpy's voice came back steady, controlled. "Mr. Torino, I believe there's been a misunderstanding about our arrangement." "No misunderstanding, boy. Just a lesson about who you're dealing with. Torino's voice hardened. You've got 24 hours to deliver the full amount, plus interest, plus an apology, and if I don't get both. The threat dangled in the silence. That's when Bumpy said something that would replay in Torino's nightmares for weeks to come. Mr. Torino, let me ask you something. When you cook a meal, do you rush it? Or do you let it simmer until it's perfect? Torino frowned. What the hell are you talking about? I'm talking about patience, about planning, about the difference between a man who reacts and a man who thinks. Bumpy's voice was silk over steel. I'll see you soon, Mr. Torino. Real soon. The line went dead. Marco laughed. Uncle, did you hear that? He's trying to sound tough. These Harlem guys, they watch too many movies. Torino wasn't laughing. Something in Bumpy's tone had sent ice water through his veins, but pride wouldn't let him show it. Instead, he doubled down. Send Tommy and Sal up to 125th Street tomorrow. I want them to visit Johnson's number spots, all of them. Let's see how tough he is when his operation's in ruins. The next morning, Tommy Benedetto and Sal Marconi drove their black Cadillac straight into the heart of Harlem, with the confidence of men who'd never been told no by anyone darker than a Mediterranean tan. They hit 3 number spots, roughed up Bumpy's collectors, and made sure everyone knew the message. Enzo Torino owned these streets. But as they celebrated their successful intimidation over drinks at Mickey's bar, they had no idea they were being watched. From across the street, a young man in a brown fedora took photographs with a telephoto lens. Every face, every license plate, every move. When word reached Bumpy about the raids, his reaction surprised everyone who knew him. He didn't explode. He didn't call for guns. He didn't even raise his voice. He smiled. Boss, said Whispers Johnson, his right-hand man. They hit us hard. The word on the street is that Torino's marking his territory. People are scared. Bumpy leaned back in his chair at the Cotton Club, sipping his whiskey with the calm of a man who held all the cards. Whispers, you ever see a master chef at work? Boss? A real chef doesn't get angry when someone messes with his kitchen. He just adjusts the recipe. Bumpy's eyes gleamed with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite amusement. It was something far more dangerous. Certainty. What you want me to do, boss? Bumpy stood up, straightening his tie. Get me a meeting with Detective Morrison. Tell him I have some information he might find interesting. And Whispers? He paused at the door. Start asking around about Torino's restaurant. I want to know everything. The suppliers, the staff, the health inspector's schedule. Everything. 3 days later, when Detective Morrison sat across from Bumpy in a diner on Amsterdam Avenue, the conversation was brief and devastating. You sure about this information, Johnson? Bumpy slid a manila envelope across the table. Check those photographs yourself, Detective. Check the dates. Check the bank records I've included. Then ask yourself, how long has the NYPD been looking for proof of Torino's money laundering operation? Morrison's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Inside were pictures of Torino's men making deposits at 4 different banks on the same day, accompanied by detailed financial records that could only have come from someone with access to very sensitive information. How did you... That's not the right question, Detective. Bumpy's voice was velvet over titanium. The right question is, what are you going to do with it? As Bumpy walked away from that diner, he knew Torino had made a critical error. The old Don had treated this like a street fight, but Bumpy Johnson had turned it into chess. And in chess, the most dangerous piece isn't the queen. It's the player who sees the whole board. While Torino celebrated what he thought was his victory over some upstart from Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was orchestrating a symphony of destruction that would make Mozart weep. The old Don had no idea that every move he'd made in the past week had been anticipated, recorded, and turned into ammunition. Bumpy's real power had never been in the numbers game. It had never been in the muscle or the territory. His real power was in understanding that information was the ultimate currency. And he'd been collecting interest on Torino's secrets for months. The meeting took place in the basement of Sylvia's restaurant, away from prying eyes and federal microphones. Around a dimly lit table sat the most dangerous collection of minds Harlem had ever assembled. Bumpy Johnson, Stephanie Saint, Claire, the original queen of numbers, Dutch Schultz's former accountant Eddie Murphy, and someone who would change everything, Detective Ray Morrison. Morrison wasn't dirty in the way most cops were dirty. He was something far more valuable. He was a man who believed in justice even when the law fell short, and he'd been watching Torino's operation poison his city for too long. "Gentleman, lady," Morrison began, lighting a cigarette with hands that had seen too much violence. "What you're proposing is either brilliant or suicide. There's no middle ground." Bumpy spread out the photographs on the table like he was dealing cards in a game where the stakes were measured in decades, not dollars. "Detective Morrison, how long has the Federal Bureau been trying to build a case against Torino's money laundering?" 3 years. 3 years of watching him turn dirty money clean through that restaurant of his. But every time we get close, witnesses disappear or evidence goes missing. Morrison's voice carried the frustration of a man who'd watched justice slip through his fingers too many times. Stephanie Saint. Claire, the woman who'd taught Bumpy everything about running numbers before retiring to her mansion in Sugar Hill, leaned forward. "Baby, you sure about this play? You're not just taking on Torino. You're taking on the entire Italian network south of the park." "Miss Stephanie," Bumpy said, using the respectful tone he reserved only for her, "when have you ever known me to make a move without seeing all the angles?" That's when Eddie Murphy, the quiet accountant who'd kept Dutch Schultz's books before Dutch's unfortunate encounter with federal bullets, spoke up. "The beauty of this isn't just the money trail, it's the timing. Torino's been getting sloppy because he thinks he's untouchable. But these bank deposits?" He tapped the photographs. "They correspond exactly with the nights when federal money from the docks goes missing. The FBI's been looking for the link between the waterfront thefts and the cash showing up clean in Italian businesses. This is their smoking gun." Morrison studied the evidence with the intensity of a man who'd finally found the key to a lock he'd been trying to pick for years. "These photographs, the bank records, the timing. Jesus Christ, Johnson, how did you get all this?" Bumpy's smile was colder than a Harlem winter. "Let's just say Torino's people aren't the only ones who know how to be invisible. The difference is, my people know how to be invisible and how to use a camera." What Morrison didn't know, what none of them knew except Bumpy, was that the real masterstroke hadn't been gathering the evidence. The real masterstroke had been the source of the evidence. Because while Torino had been busy sending his boys to rough up Harlem numbers runners, his own nephew Marco had been selling information to Bumpy Johnson for 6 months. Marco Torino, the arrogant prince of Little Italy, had a gambling problem that made his uncle's restaurant look like a lemonade stand. He owed money to people who didn't send polite collection letters. And when Bumpy had quietly arranged for those debts to be bought and transferred to his organization, Marco had discovered that his choices were simple: cooperate or become fish food in the Hudson River. "Here's how this plays out," Bumpy continued, his voice carrying the authority of a general briefing his troops. "Tomorrow night, Torino's expecting me to show up with my tail between my legs, begging for mercy and carrying that missing 3,000 plus interest. Instead, I'm going to walk into his restaurant and I'm going to cook him a meal he'll never forget." Morrison frowned. "Cook? What the hell are you talking about?" "Detective, you ever watch a master chef prepare a dish? Every ingredient has its purpose, every timing is precise, every element works together to create something unforgettable." Bumpy stood up, straightening his jacket. "Tomorrow night, I'm going to serve Torino the truth, and the FBI is going to be there to take his order." Stephanie St. Clair laughed, a sound like champagne bubbles mixed with gunpowder. "Baby, you are one dangerous man. Your grandmother would be proud." As they prepared to leave, Morrison had one last question. "Johnson, what makes you so sure Torino will be there tomorrow night? What if he smells the setup?" Bumpy paused at the basement stairs, his hand on the railing. "Detective, let me ask you something. If someone challenged your authority in front of your entire organization, if they disrespected you on your own territory, if they made you look weak?" He turned back, his eyes reflecting the overhead light like a predator's. "Would you hide? Or would you make sure everyone saw you put them in their place?" Morrison nodded slowly, understanding flooding his face. "Torino's pride is going to be his downfall. He can't resist the chance to humiliate me publicly. He thinks I'm coming to grovel. Instead, I'm coming to serve him the last supper he'll ever eat as a free man. As Bumpy climbed those basement stairs, he wasn't just a numbers runner from Harlem anymore. He was a man who'd turned his enemy's arrogance into a weapon. He was a chess master who'd been playing 3 moves ahead while everyone else was still figuring out the rules. The only question left was whether Torino would understand what was happening before it was too late. The kitchen at Torino's restaurant had never seen anything like what was about to unfold. As Bumpy Johnson tied that simple white apron around his expensive suit, every person in that dining room understood they were witnessing something that would be talked about in whispers for generations. Torino's confusion quickly turned to rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing, boy? You think this is some kind of joke?" Bumpy moved toward the kitchen with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the moment. "Mr. Torino, I told you I was going to cook for you. A man should always keep his word." The restaurant's head chef, a nervous Italian man named Giuseppe, backed away as Bumpy entered his domain. But Bumpy wasn't interested in the stove or the fancy equipment. He walked straight to the walk-in refrigerator and began pulling out ingredients with surgical precision. "You see, Mr. Torino," Bumpy called out as he worked, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent restaurant. "Cooking is like running a business. You need the right ingredients, the proper technique, and most importantly," he paused, holding up a large onion, "you need to understand that some things make you cry, whether you want to or not." Torino's men were on edge, hands hovering near their weapons, but their boss held them back with a raised hand. His pride wouldn't let him admit that a black man from Harlem was making him nervous in his own establishment. "Get to the point, Johnson. You came here to apologize and pay what you owe. Do it, or get out." That's when Bumpy did something that sent ice through everyone's veins. He laughed. Not a nervous laugh or a bitter laugh, but the deep, genuine laughter of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. "Mr. Torino, you think I came here to pay you money?" Bumpy began peeling the onion with a knife that gleamed under the kitchen lights. "You think this is about $3,000? Man, you really don't understand what kind of game you've been playing." The first ingredient went into a large pot, the onion, chopped with professional precision. "This here represents tears," Bumpy announced. "The tears of every family you've destroyed with your protection racket." Torino stood up, his face darkening. "What are you?" "Sit down," Bumpy commanded, and something in his voice made the Don obey without thinking. "I'm not done cooking yet." Next came carrots, diced perfectly. "These represent the hope you've stolen from my community. Orange like the sunrise my people don't get to see because they're too busy working 3 jobs to pay your tribute." The entire restaurant watched, hypnotized as Bumpy continued his bizarre performance. But it wasn't a performance. It was a trial, and Torino was about to discover he'd been found guilty by a jury of his own actions. "Now for the meat," Bumpy said, pulling out a large cut of beef. "This represents the muscle you think makes you strong, but muscle without brains?" He began cutting the meat with deadly efficiency. "It's just dead weight." That's when Detective Morrison walked through the front door, followed by 4 FBI agents in dark suits. But instead of moving toward Bumpy, they positioned themselves around Torino's table. Torino's eyes darted between Bumpy and the federal agents. What is this?" Bumpy added water to his pot and turned up the heat. "This, Mr. Torino, is what we call in Harlem a come-to-Jesus moment. You see, while you were busy playing tough guy with my operation, I was gathering the ingredients for a very special meal." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, identical to the one he'd given Morrison days earlier. But this one was sealed with Torino's own business letterhead. "Your nephew Marco is quite the photographer," Bumpy said casually, stirring his impromptu stew. "Turns out he's been documenting your money laundering operation for months. Every bank deposit, every fake invoice, every federal dollar you've been washing through this kitchen." The color drained from Torino's face. "Marco would never—" "Marco owes some very dangerous people a lot of money," Bumpy interrupted. "Money I now own, money that bought me his loyalty and his cooperation. You want to know what the secret ingredient is in every good recipe, Mr. Torino?" The room held its collective breath. patience, and planning, and understanding that in the real game, the man who controls the information controls everything. Bumpy turned off the burner and faced Torino directly. You thought you could intimidate me with muscle. But while your boys were busy playing tough in Harlem, I was serving your nephew's gambling debts, earning his gratitude, and collecting evidence that's going to put you away for the rest of your natural life. Morrison stepped forward, badge visible. Enzo Torino, you're under arrest for money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. You have the right to remain silent. As the handcuffs clicked around Torino's wrists, his eyes never left Bumpy's face. You think you've won? You think this is over? My family has connections you can't even imagine. Bumpy untied his apron and laid it on the counter like he was hanging up a uniform after a long day's work. Mr. Torino, your family just lost their biggest earner, their money launderer, and their reputation. But more than that. He leaned close enough that only Torino could hear his next words. They lost to a black man from Harlem who you called boy. How do you think that's going to play in the newspapers tomorrow? As the FBI led Torino away, his restaurant empire crumbling around him, Bumpy walked back through the dining room with the same unhurried pace he'd entered with. But now, every eye in that room looked at him with something they'd never shown a black man before. Respect. At the door, he paused and turned back to address Giuseppe, the head chef. The stew's going to need another hour. Low heat. Sometimes the best meals take time to come together just right. If you think Torino got exactly what he deserved for disrespecting the King of Harlem, hit that like button. Because what happened next would cement Bumpy Johnson's reputation as the most dangerous man in New York City. 3 months after Torino's arrest, the ripple effects of that night at the restaurant had transformed the entire criminal landscape of New York City. The old Don sat in a federal holding cell, waiting for a trial that would never come. Because the evidence Bumpy had orchestrated was so airtight that Torino's lawyers were already negotiating a plea deal. But the real story wasn't happening in the courtrooms. It was happening in the boardrooms of every major crime family from Brooklyn to the Bronx. The Commission, that shadowy council of family bosses who had ruled organized crime for decades, called an emergency meeting. For the first time in their history, they weren't discussing territory disputes or profit margins. They were discussing how one black man from Harlem had outsmarted their entire system and made them all look like amateurs. Salvatore, the fish Luciano, paced the room like a caged animal. Gentlemen, we have a problem. This Johnson character didn't just take down Enzo. He exposed how vulnerable our entire operation is to someone who understands modern investigation techniques. Frank Costello, the political fixer who had judges and politicians in his pocket, set down his espresso cup with hands that weren't quite steady. The newspapers are calling it the kitchen conspiracy. They're treating this Bumpy Johnson like he's some kind of criminal mastermind. Worse, they're treating him like he's legitimate. That word hung in the air like a death sentence. Legitimate. For generations, the Italian families had maintained power by ensuring that people like Bumpy Johnson were never seen as anything more than street-level dealers. But now, every major newspaper in the country was running headlines about the chess master of Harlem and the man who cooked the mob's goose. The meeting took an even darker turn when Costello revealed what his police contacts had told him. The FBI is using Torino's case as a template. They're applying the same investigation methods to all of our operations. Bank records, photographed transactions turned informants. Johnson didn't just destroy Enzo. He gave the feds a blueprint for destroying all of us. Meanwhile, up in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was experiencing something he'd never known before, genuine respect from people who had previously only feared him. The Cotton Club, where he held court most evenings, had become a pilgrimage destination for anyone in the game who wanted to understand how power really worked. Young dealers and veteran numbers runners alike would sit in the back booths, nursing their drinks and listening to the man who had proven that intelligence would always beat intimidation. But Bumpy wasn't celebrating. He was planning. You see, he told a room full of lieutenants and allies, his voice carrying the weight of a professor lecturing graduate students. What happened with Torino wasn't about revenge. It was about establishing a new order. For too long, we've let other people define the rules of our own neighborhoods. Stephanie St. Clair, Now his closest advisor and the woman who had taught him that information was more valuable than muscle nodded approvingly. Baby, you didn't just beat them at their own game. You changed the game entirely. The truth of that statement became clear when Detective Morrison received a visit from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover himself. The federal government, which had been struggling to make cases against organized crime for years, suddenly found itself with a new weapon, the Bumpy Johnson method. Detective Morrison, Hoover said during their private meeting, this Johnson character has done more to advance federal law enforcement in 6 months than we've accomplished in 6 years. His understanding of how to gather admissible evidence while operating within legal boundaries. It's revolutionary. Morrison lit a cigarette, remembering the basement meeting that had started it all. Sir, Johnson isn't just smart. He's patient. He thinks in chess moves while everyone else is still playing checkers. And more importantly, he understands that the most dangerous weapon in any criminal enterprise isn't a gun or a knife. It's a camera and a man who knows how to use it. But perhaps the most telling indicator of how completely Bumpy had changed the game came 6 months later, when Marco Torino, free from his gambling debts and his uncle's shadow, opened a legitimate photography studio in Greenwich Village. He specialized in wedding portraits and family photos, and every picture he took was a reminder of how images could capture truth more powerfully than any gun ever could. The studio's opening night attracted an unusual guest. Bumpy Johnson arrived in his finest suit, carrying a bouquet of flowers and wearing the kind of smile that suggested he understood irony better than most people understood themselves. Mr. Torino, he said, shaking Marco's hand in front of a room full of Greenwich Village society types, I hear you found your true calling. Photography is a powerful art form. It shows people exactly what they need to see. Marco's response was barely a whisper. Mr. Johnson, I want you to know what I did to my uncle. It wasn't about the money you paid off for me. It was about finally understanding that some people deserve what happens to them. As Bumpy walked away from that photography studio, he wasn't just the king of Harlem anymore. He had become something far more dangerous and far more respected. He had become a legend, not because of what he had destroyed, but because of what he had built in its place. The numbers game continued. The territory remained his. But now every criminal organization in America knew that the rules had changed forever. Muscle without brains was just dead weight. Information was the ultimate currency. And patience, properly applied, could topple empires. Years later, when young criminals would ask how Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had become the most feared and respected man in New York City, the old-timers would tell them about the night he walked into a mob boss's restaurant and cooked him a meal that changed everything. But the real lesson wasn't about cooking. It was about understanding that true power comes from knowing exactly who your enemies are, what they value most, and how to take it away from them without them realizing it until it's too late. Some meals, after all, are best served cold. And Bumpy Johnson had proven that the most satisfying revenge is the kind that leaves your enemy wondering how they ended up on the menu. But the most profound change wasn't happening in the boardrooms or the federal buildings. It was happening in the mirror every morning when Bumpy Johnson looked at himself and saw something he'd never seen before. A man who had transcended the streets without abandoning them. The transformation of Harlem itself told the real story. Where once there had been fear and submission to outside forces, now there was pride. The community that had watched one of their own outthink the Italian mob began to understand that intelligence and strategy could accomplish what violence and intimidation never could. Young men who might have once dreamed of becoming muscle for hire now sought education. The Apollo Theater, where Bumpy often held informal court, became an unlikely classroom where street wisdom met business acumen. He would sit in the back booths, teaching anyone who would listen the most important lesson of all. Respect isn't taken. It's earned through excellence. You see, he told a gathering of young entrepreneurs and numbers runners one evening, what happened with Torino wasn't about destroying one man. It was about proving that our minds are our most powerful weapons. Every time someone underestimates us because of where we come from or what we look like, they're handing us an advantage. The lesson resonated far beyond Harlem's boundaries. In Chicago, policy kings began adopting Bumpy's methods of documentation and evidence gathering. In Detroit, Numbers runners started thinking like businessmen rather than street dealers. Across the country, the criminal underworld was quietly revolutionizing itself, thanks to the blueprint one man had written in Torino's kitchen. But perhaps the most telling sign of Bumpy's complete victory came 2 years later, when Enzo Torino's restaurant was purchased by an investment group and transformed into the Cotton Club downtown, a legitimate jazz venue that showcased black artists and served soul food alongside Italian classics. The grand opening featured Ella Fitzgerald and Duke Ellington. The guest of honor was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, who arrived in a tuxedo that cost more than most people's monthly rent and carried himself with the dignity of a man who had proven that class wasn't about bloodlines or tradition. It was about how you conducted yourself when the world was watching. The final twist in this story came when Marco Torino, now a successful photographer, approached Bumpy during the opening reception. In his hands was a framed photograph, the image of his uncle being led away in handcuffs, captured from across the street on that fateful night. "Mr. Johnson," Marco said, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and something approaching awe, "I wanted you to have this. It's the moment everything changed, not just for my family, but for everyone who thought they understood how power works in this city." Bumpy studied the photograph with the careful attention he gave to everything that mattered. In the image, Torino looked smaller than he had in life, diminished by the handcuffs and the federal agents surrounding him. But in the background, barely visible through the restaurant's window, you could see Bumpy himself, calm, composed, untouchable. "Marco," Bumpy said finally, "this picture tells a story that needs to be remembered. It shows that justice doesn't always come from a courthouse or a gun. Sometimes it comes from a kitchen, served by a man who understands that the best revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation." Years later, when historians would try to pinpoint the moment when organized crime began its slow decline in America, many would point to federal legislation or increased law enforcement. But the real students of power knew better. They knew it began the night a man from Harlem walked into a mob boss's restaurant and proved that intelligence, properly applied, could topple any empire. Torino died in federal prison 8 years later, a broken man who never understood that his greatest mistake wasn't underestimating Bumpy Johnson's intelligence. It was underestimating his patience. Bumpy Johnson lived for 3 more decades, during which time he transformed from the king of Harlem into something far more powerful, a legend. A man whose story would be told and retold, growing more powerful with each telling because it proved that no matter where you come from, no matter what obstacles stand in your way, excellence will always find a way to rise. The kitchen where it all happened still stands today, now part of a cooking school that teaches both culinary arts and business management to young people from all 5 boroughs. Above the entrance, there's a small plaque that reads, "Excellence is the best revenge." Most people who see it assume it's just motivational nonsense, but the old-timers who remember that night know better. They know it's a reminder that some meals take years to prepare, but when they're finally served, they change everything. And they know that somewhere in Harlem's history, there's a man who proved that the most dangerous weapon in any kitchen isn't a knife, it's a mind that knows exactly how to use everything at its disposal.